Maybe you're new to the channel or maybe you've been around for a while, but one thing you should know is that I love Micro Four Thirds, going all the way back to the GH1. That was kind of the first hybrid mirrorless camera I ever bought, hacked it, loved it, and have been shooting Micro Four Thirds ever since. Even to this day, I still use Micro Four Thirds, even though Lumix has gone full frame with the S5 Mark II, the S9, and now the new cameras like the S1 Mark II, which seems to be very popular. A lot of people are buying that. The S1R Mark II and the S1 Mark IIe. They've even got new full frame lenses like the 24-60, which also seems to be selling quite well. But even to this day, having all of those options and what I currently shoot with, which is the S5 Mark II, the S9, I still pick up the GH7 from time to time for a few reasons. And every time I do, I'm reminded why I love Micro Four Thirds. But before we get started, like this video, hit the subscribe button and consider joining the channel. Channel members get exclusive access to Filmmaker Alchemy, behind the scenes lessons and insights on the business of video production. Learn how to turn your content into gold. The 4K this, the 6K that, oh, the IBIS is 7 or 8 stops of stabilization, or you can do this, that, or the other. But for me, it comes down to a few simple things. With the GH7, first and foremost is that we got probably the best Micro Four Thirds camera sensor combination with phase detect autofocus. Yes, it came first for Lumix and Micro Four Thirds on the G9 Mark II, but the G9 Mark II overheats, and that's kind of a deal breaker for me. The GH7 has never overheated on me once. I've never even got a warning on it. And I, if you don't know, am in Phoenix, Arizona. And in the summer, it gets quite hot here in the desert. And the GH7 can withstand it totally fine. It has the proper thermal management, the vents, the fans, the exhaust. It's all good when it comes to the not overheating with the GH7. And it's that great Micro Four Thirds sensor with phase detect autofocus. The GH6 I also own. I do like the GH6, but it was missing that critical component, the good quality, reliable autofocus in video. And now we got that on the GH7. So I really like it. It's just a starting point. I think it's probably the best Micro Four Thirds, a Lumix camera you could get, although there arguably are reasons. Maybe you would want like a GH5 or a GH5S for very niche specific reasons. But the GH7 is a good all-arounder starter just because it has that phase detect autofocus. But beyond that, so does the S5 Mark II, so does the S9. All the Lumix full frame cameras now are coming out with phase detect autofocus. So what's so special about Micro Four Thirds? It's something else that is lost when you go to full frame. It's that the full sensor aspect ratio on Micro Four Thirds, 4:3, you actually have taller sensors on Micro Four Thirds based on the aspect ratio relatively. The sensor itself is smaller, but it's a taller aspect ratio than 3:2, which is what you'll get on full frame. So I'm shooting open gate, which is one of the main advantages of these Lumix cameras, is I'm actually getting taller footage. And yes, the full frame cameras do have a 4:3 mode, but it's cropped in, so you're losing resolution. Your field of view probably is still greater than Micro Four Thirds, depending on your lens, depending on what you're doing. But in general, it's just nice to have a taller sensor as a starting point on the GH7. Those are good, solid reasons. The phase detect autofocus, the taller aspect ratio sensor. But one of the biggest things that I come to the GH7 time and time again is for time code. Via the PC flash port, sync port, whatever you call it on the GH7, GH6 had it. I think maybe in the GH5 had it. But basically it's the flash sync port. You can run time code in there and it has nothing to do with your audio channels. If you're using Tentacle Sync devices for timecode, which I highly recommend, some kind of timecode solution. I chose Tentacle Sync. There's others out there. They're not, Tentacle Sync isn't currently supported on the new full frame S1 Mark II, S1R Mark II, the Bluetooth timecode that those have. That's only an Atomos Blue Ultra Sync, whatever it's called at this point in time. Maybe that changes with firmware in the future, but right now, the only way I can get timecode into a camera without affecting the audio channels is on my GH7. So if I have a multi-camera setup and I need to run timecode to all of them, which is a good idea, you should be doing that. And I also need to capture audio and I want it on a camera, so it's one less thing to sync later and it's an easy thing to monitor. I can use the GH7. And by the way, I can also use that XLR2 adapter and get 32-bit float audio on the GH7 and still have time code completely separate. So 4 tracks of audio on the GH7, 32-bit float, and I still get time code. That to me is one of like the biggest reasons why I still use the GH7, because all my other Lumix full frame cameras, if I want to get time code into them, I have to hijack an audio port, and that's just not a lot of fun. And it's, how am I going to get my microphones recorded into the camera as well? It's easier on the GH7. And something I'm hoping we see on future Lumix cameras is the ability to do, yes, Bluetooth timecode is great, but the timecode port functionality on the GH7 and the GH6 is really, really critical for a lot of us if we're shooting multi-camera. And at this point in time, you probably have a bunch of cameras. It's nice when they all can kind of talk to each other. They're not literally talking to each other with timecode, but they talk to each other later in post-production when you sync them all up. Very, very nice thing to have. And I want to go back and touch on OpenGate just for a moment. I've talked about this a lot recently, but I think it still remains to be said. One of the biggest reasons for OpenGate shooting is the multi-aspect production. Yes, vertical and horizontal at the same time. But I've been doing a lot of shoots lately where I'm stacking my cameras one on top of the other. And it sounds a little crazy, but these cameras are so lightweight and small, compact. You can actually do it quite well. And the only downside is when you configure a camera on top of a camera is that your vertical composition is slightly off, depending on your lens, your focal length, etc. But if you have 2 cameras stacked on top of each other, different focal lengths, and the composition is slightly off vertically because they're stacked vertically, the beauty of that taller sensor is that you can reframe vertically for 16:9. So even if you're not doing vertical video, even if you're not doing anamorphic, if you want to stack a camera on top of a camera and shoot kind of 2 cameras from one person shooter, and other benefit of the phase detect is that you're not pulling focus on both. You can rely pretty consistently on the autofocus. You can actually reframe your composition vertically, which is the one downside of stacking your cameras that way. The composition gets a little off, but you can undo it by shooting OpenGate. There's so many fun little things you can get out of these cameras when you start thinking that way, thinking, how can I use these features to my advantage? Okay, I've got an army of Lumix cameras. None of them can handle audio and timecode except for the one. Well, now all of a sudden that is the most important camera in your lineup, even though the other ones might be better in terms of dynamic range or low light or ISO noise, whatever you want to chalk it up to, the color you might prefer on a certain camera. But the functionality is where it always wins. And it's one of the biggest reasons I keep hammering home some kind of internal electronic ND, because the actual functionality of that is so great that it offsets some of the other trade-offs or compromises you might be making. In fact, someone left a comment recently on a video talking about, Lumix should have done the electronic ND filter internally earlier in the Micro Four Thirds. This person was surprised that Lumix never did that on Micro Four Thirds. And I think it's probably the biggest reason that the GH6 and the GH7 didn't sell as well as the GH5. By that point in time, people had moved on to Sony. They're looking for autofocus. They're looking for full frame. They're looking for low light. They're looking for all these features and functionality that just wasn't there anymore on the Lumix cameras. It never was, but all the benefits like 10-bit, 422, maybe 4K 60, the IBIS, all of those little features showed up elsewhere on other brands. And I think, hindsight is 2020, but I think had Lumix actually put in an internal ND system on the GH6 or the GH7, maybe it's physically not possible, I don't know. But if they had done it, I think they would actually sold quite well, because that functionality is so strong, that feature is so powerful. So even something like a GH7, that the sensor is smaller and Micro Four Thirds, it's not as good as full frame, I still use Micro Four Thirds because of some of those baked in hardware features that I just don't have a good solution for on the full frame lineup. Of course, that'll always change. We move into the future, new cameras will come out, new features will be added, etc. And so there will be a point in time where the things I'm talking about with the GH7 is like, yeah, I can still do that a different way. Maybe the Bluetooth timecode on these new full frame cameras, maybe they do start supporting the tentacle sync protocol. Maybe that happens, and so it's less of a need. But right now, there are shoots I couldn't do without the GH7, at least to the efficiency that I appreciate for my workflow. If all of a sudden I now can't run time code, or I have to do some other hacky workaround, go back to pluralize some terrible, slow, that's not what I'm looking for. There's a good way to do it, and there's a bad way to do it. And the GH7 plays a critical part in that, let alone all the other great features of Micro Four Thirds. You know this, but the lenses in general tend to be smaller. Yes, you can argue whether that's really true for the full frame equivalent, because the depth of field is different, all this stuff, right? But in general, the lenses tend to be smaller. You can fit more of them if you're traveling. So there's really good reasons to still pick Micro Four Thirds from time to time. I will say that in general, I'm happier with the images I get out of my full frame cameras. I do think they are cleaner, but that's not always the most important thing. And oftentimes it's the part that is insignificant at the end of the day, because if you're publishing on YouTube, all the clean versus noise versus whatever gets compressed anyway and just kind of disappears and ends up being not even a point. Most people shooting, if you're shooting 8K or 6K, the final person watching is watching a low res 480p stream or a 720p stream or a 1080p stream. There's certain things from a production standpoint that do matter, and there's other things that matter less depending on those final deliverables. And I like to maximize everything. Yes, I want the resolution to be great, dynamic range, low light, ISO, all these things. I want them to be good, but in the balancing act of how it all adds up, there's certain things about the GH7 that just win as that primary camera that I have to have with me to do certain things that the other cameras just can't. If I need that full shifting open gate functionality for vertical reframing, I'm going to go with something like a GH7 for that 4x3. Or maybe I'll go to a 4x3 mode on a full frame camera if I'm willing to take the resolution hit. But that comes with some other sacrifices and compromises too, right? The grain structure gets bigger as you crop in. There are all these little things that you probably know about, we maybe geek out about, but you have to weigh that all when you're doing production. What trade-offs are you willing to make? And for me, the GH7 is really that cornerstone of a lot of my productions, where I'm able to get everything working better because I have the GH7 in my kit. It's not the best camera. It's not even necessarily my favorite camera, but it is one that I consistently come back to time and time again because it gets so much right. And that's why I just am constantly falling in love with Micro Four Thirds over and over and over again, because it does so much so well, and still to this day is an important puzzle piece in the tapestry of my production.